Harlem, New York. 10:34 p.m. Saturday, September 17, 1966. The temperature had dropped to 42 degrees, and steam rose from manholes on Lenox Avenue like ghosts escaping from underground graves. Inside the back room of Minton's Playhouse, the air was thick with cigarette smoke and the kind of tension that makes smart men leave early. The jazz had stopped 20 minutes ago. Now there was only the sound of ice clinking in glasses and the deliberate scrape of a chair being pulled closer to a table. Vincent "Vinny Numbers" Torino sat at the center of the room, a man who had mistaken Bumpy Johnson's recent hospitalization for permanent weakness. At 38 years old, Torino controlled a small but profitable numbers operation in East Harlem and had been expanding into Bumpy's territory while the King of Harlem recovered from heart surgery. He wore a charcoal gray suit, Italian leather shoes, and the kind of confidence that comes from never having faced real consequences. Tonight, that confidence would cost him everything. Torino was holding court, telling stories to a circle of hangers-on who laughed too loud at jokes that weren't funny. In his left hand, he held a photograph. The photograph showed Bumpy Johnson leaving Abyssinian Baptist Church the previous Sunday, dressed in a navy blue dress and pearl earrings, walking with the dignity of a woman who had never bowed to anyone. Torino tapped the photograph with his index finger, leaving a grease stain from the fried chicken he'd been eating with his hands. Harlem's so-called queen, he sneered, his voice carrying across the room like a disease, walking around like she owns the neighborhood. But everybody knows what she really is. He said it then. The word that sealed his fate, a racial slur followed by graphic speculation about Mame Johnson's private life. He claimed she had been seen entering hotels with younger men. He described imaginary encounters in explicit detail. He called her a whore. He called Bumpy a fool. He said the King of Harlem couldn't even control his own wife. The room went silent. Glasses stopped moving. Conversations died. Even the bartender froze, a bottle of bourbon halfway to a glass. For 6 seconds, Minton's Playhouse forgot how to breathe. Torino smiled, satisfied. He believed disrespect was a weapon. He believed humiliation was cheaper than bullets. He believed Bumpy Johnson was too old, too sick, and too weak to respond. He was wrong about everything. At 10:41 p.m., 7 minutes after the insult, a young woman in a waitress uniform walked past the table, carrying nothing but a folded napkin and a coffee pot. She didn't make eye contact with anyone. Her job was not to see. Her job was to remember. 4 blocks away, in a private booth at Wells Restaurant, Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson sat across from Frank Lucas, sharing a quiet dinner of fried chicken and collard greens. When the waitress arrived and whispered her report, Bumpy set down his fork, wiped his mouth with a cloth napkin, and closed his eyes for exactly 10 seconds. When he opened them, the temperature in the room seemed to drop 20 degrees. There was no explosion of rage, no shouted threats, no dramatic gestures. Bumpy simply reached into his jacket pocket and removed a fountain pen. He turned to a clean napkin, wrote 4 words in neat handwriting, and slid it across the table to Frank Lucas. Lucas read it and looked up, his face pale. The napkin said, 72 hours. Bloodletter. What happened over the next 3 days would become legend in Harlem's underworld. The apology letter Vincent Torino would be forced to write would be discovered by police on September 21st, and the method of its composition would make even hardened detectives vomit. The letter would be written in Torino's own blood, carved into his chest with surgical precision, each word a testament to the cost of disrespecting the wrong man's wife. The story of how Vincent "Vinny Numbers" Torino lost everything is a warning that history has tried to hide. If you enjoy these deep dives into the underworld, you can support the channel by buying me a coffee using the link in the description. Your support keeps these investigations alive. Now let's go back to Saturday, September 17th, 1966. September 17th, 1966. 10:00 p.m. Harlem was operating on half power, its criminal ecosystem destabilized by 32 days of uncertainty. Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson had only been released from Harlem Hospital 3 weeks earlier, his heart surgery still a whispered topic in back rooms and barbershops. In the underworld, perception is the only currency that matters, and when a king bleeds, the jackals do not wait for the funeral. They begin to circle the moment the first drop hits the floor. Men who had spent decades bowing their heads were suddenly looking up, testing the structural integrity of an empire built on respect and fear. Vincent Vinny Numbers Torino had been waiting for this moment since the first rumors of Bumpy's failing health trickled through the streets. He was not a boss, not a general, but a mid-level numbers runner who had operated a modest policy racket in East Harlem since 1961. His network generated approximately $12,000 monthly, existing solely because Bumpy Johnson allowed it to exist. For 10 years, Torino had paid his tribute on time, smiling and nodding while harboring deep, resentful envy. But Bumpy's hospitalization had changed the mathematics of ambition. Over 6 weeks, Torino had systematically tested boundaries. He expanded westward, absorbing 3 of Bumpy's collection points on 116th Street. When no retaliation came, he grew bolder, recruiting runners who had sworn loyalty to the Johnson organization. By mid-September, Torino controlled territory, generating $38,000 monthly. What began as calculated business encroachment had metastasized into something more dangerous: contempt. He started speaking about Bumpy in public, calling him finished, yesterday's news. The racial subtext was never subtle. At Minton's Playhouse, with 18 witnesses present, Torino made the mistake that would cost him everything. He pulled out a photograph of Mame Johnson, tapping it with his grease-stained finger from the fried chicken he had been eating with his hands. In the unwritten constitution of the underworld, wives and children are civilians, invisible and untouchable. Torino shattered this sacred law with casual brutality. He called her a name first, a racial slur that combined hatred and misogyny in one efficient cut. He claimed she had been seen entering the Teresa Hotel at odd hours with men half her age. He described explicit fictional encounters in graphic detail, using language designed to humiliate and degrade. He said Bumpy Johnson couldn't satisfy his own wife, couldn't control his own household, couldn't maintain respect in his own bedroom. He called her a whore who had been servicing Harlem's elite while her husband lay dying. He laughed while he said it, his mouth full of food, grease shining on his lips. The reaction was immediate and absolute. The ambient noise of the club ceased instantly. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. Card games froze with hands halfway to the table. The piano player's fingers went still on the keys. Even Torino's own associates, the 2 men who had arrived with him and laughed at his earlier jokes, began sliding their chairs backward, creating distance measured in inches but understood in miles. The silence that followed was suffocating, the kind of pressure that precedes a detonation. What Torino didn't understand was that Harlem had eyes everywhere. The waitress refilling water glasses heard every word. The busboy clearing tables heard every word. The bartender polishing glasses 40 feet away heard every word. They heard, remembered, and reported because that was the intelligence network that had kept Bumpy Johnson in power for 3 decades. At 10:47 p.m., 36 minutes after Torino's poison left his mouth, the waitress from Minton's walked into Wells' restaurant. She approached the private booth where Bumpy Johnson sat with Frank Lucas, sharing a quiet meal. She leaned down, whispered her report in clinical detail, and stepped back. Bumpy set down his fork with surgical precision, wiped his mouth with a cloth napkin, and closed his eyes for exactly 10 seconds. There was no explosion. No shouted threats. Bumpy simply reached into his jacket pocket, removed a fountain pen, and wrote 4 words on a clean napkin. He slid it across to Frank Lucas, who read it and went pale. The napkin said 72 hours. Bloodletter. Lucas asked the question that had to be asked. What does that mean? Bumpy folded his hands on the table, his voice quiet and cold as winter ground. It means Vincent Torino is going to write an apology to my wife, and he's going to use his own blood as ink. September 18th, 1966. 6 a.m. The machinery of retribution began to turn while Vincent Torino slept, unaware that his existence was being dissected with surgical precision. Bumpy Johnson did not operate on rage or impulse. He operated on data, on systematic destruction, on the kind of methodical planning that transforms personal insult into public education. Before the sun crested over the tenements of East Harlem, 12 phone calls had been made to 12 different people, each assigned a specific piece of Vincent Torino's life to examine, document, and prepare for dismantling. This was not a hunt conducted by thugs or muscle. This was an audit performed by invisible professionals. Taxi drivers who knew every route Torino traveled, building superintendents who controlled access to his safe spaces, restaurant workers who served his meals and overheard his conversations, postal carriers who knew his mail patterns, shop owners who processed his money, barbers who cut his hair and heard his bragging. These were the eyes and ears that had kept Bumpy Johnson in power for 3 decades, a surveillance network that operated with the efficiency of a government agency and the invisibility of shadows. By 8 a.m., Torino's entire routine had been mapped and timed. He woke at 9:30 a.m. in his 3rd-floor apartment on Pleasant Avenue, drank coffee with milk and 2 sugars while reading racing forms, and left his building at 10:15 a.m. driving a 1965 Cadillac DeVille, license plate number documented. His first collection stop was a barber shop on 1st Avenue, followed by a social club on 116th Street, then a basement office beneath a butcher shop. He ate lunch at the same diner on 112th Street every day except Sunday, when he preferred Rouse. His girlfriend, Angela Russo, 26 years old, cocktail waitress at the Copacabana, lived on East 108th Street and worked Tuesday through Saturday nights. His mother, 72-year-old Rosa Torino, attended 7 a.m. Mass at Our Lady of Mount Carmel Church every morning and lived alone in a 4th-floor walk-up in the Bronx. Within 12 hours, the intelligence file was complete. Photographs captured every aspect of Torino's world from angles that proved the photographers had been standing close, undetected, professional. His mother leaving church with rosary beads wrapped around arthritic fingers. Angela laughing with friends outside the beauty salon where she had her hair done every Tuesday. Torino himself, photographed through his apartment window that very morning while he drank coffee in his undershirt, completely unaware that his privacy had been violated. The images were crisp, clear, and terrifying in their intimacy. At 2:30 p.m., Torino sat at his usual corner table at Rouse, cutting into veal parmigiana and discussing expansion plans with 2 associates. The restaurant was warm, filled with the comfortable sounds of silverware against plates and quiet conversation. Torino felt invincible, still riding the adrenaline high from the previous night's performance at Minton's Playhouse. When the postal worker entered, Torino barely looked up. The man wore a complete uniform, carried a worn leather bag, and walked with the tired gait of someone completing a mundane government route. The worker approached the table directly, placed a manila envelope next to Torino's wine glass, and departed without a word. Torino opened it casually, expecting payment from one of his runners or routine business correspondence. Instead, 8 photographs spilled across the white tablecloth like evidence at a crime scene. The first showed his mother. The second showed Angela. The third through seventh documented his business locations from impossible angles. The eighth showed him in his apartment that morning, vulnerable and unaware. Beneath the photographs lay a single sheet of paper, typed with the cold precision of a legal document. The message was formatted like a business letter, devoid of emotion or theatrics. It informed Vincent Torino that he had 48 hours to deliver a handwritten apology to Mrs. Mame Johnson at 409 Edgecombe Avenue. The apology must acknowledge each fabricated story he had spread about her character, must specify the racial slurs he had used, and must be signed in his own blood. The letter concluded with a single sentence that carried the weight of mathematical certainty. Failure to comply would result in consequences extending beyond Torino himself to every person documented in the accompanying photographs. Torino's reaction was exactly what Bumpy had predicted. He laughed, a forced sound that echoed hollow in the restaurant's warm atmosphere. He tore the photographs in half and dropped them onto his plate, watching tomato sauce soak into the images of his mother and girlfriend. He called Bumpy an old man playing desperate games, a relic trying to maintain relevance through empty intimidation. His associates nodded, but their enthusiasm had diminished considerably, their eyes lingering on the torn photographs with growing unease. The isolation began immediately and systematically. Torino spent the next 4 hours making phone calls to his limited connections in the Italian mob families. Salvatore Mondello, a capo in the Genovese family, who had previously expressed interest in partnership ventures, was suddenly unavailable, out of town indefinitely. His cousin in the Lucchese organization claimed urgent business and promised to call back later, a promise that would never be fulfilled. 17 calls were made. 14 went unanswered. 3 were answered by people who suddenly remembered pressing appointments and ended conversations with uncomfortable speed. By 6:00 p.m., Torino's infrastructure began to collapse. The social club where he conducted daily business called to inform him they were closed for emergency repairs, timeline uncertain. His usual safe apartment over the butcher shop had new locks and a new tenant. His protection detail, 2 former boxers he paid $300 weekly to stand near him with guns, left messages claiming family emergencies required their immediate attention in New Jersey. The ground beneath his feet was evaporating in real time, each phone call revealing another severed connection, another burned bridge. September 19th, 11 p.m. Torino sat in his apartment with doors locked, windows covered, and a .38 revolver on the coffee table beside him. He had not slept properly in 36 hours. When the soft knock came, polite and measured, he approached the door with the gun in his hand. Through the peephole, he saw nothing. When he opened the door, no one was there. Only another manila envelope resting against the doorframe like a death sentence delivered by ghosts. Inside was a single photograph. Vincent Torino sleeping in his bed, mouth open, face peaceful, completely vulnerable. The image had been taken from an angle that proved someone had been standing inside his locked apartment that very morning, close enough to touch him, close enough to kill him, choosing instead to document his helplessness. The message was typed on the same business-like stationery, 24 hours remaining. The blood can be from a finger prick, or it can be from somewhere more painful. Your choice. September 20th, 1966. 6 a.m. Vincent Torino sat in his living room counting cash for the 3rd time. Not because he doubted the total of $8,300, but because counting gave him the illusion of control over something, anything, in a world that had systematically stripped away every option. 24 hours remained before Bumpy Johnson's deadline expired. 1,440 minutes, each one passing with the relentless certainty of a countdown to execution. At 6:47 a.m., desperation produced a plan. He would run. New York was large, but America was larger. 7:32 a.m. Torino's first escape attempt began at Grand Central Terminal. He purchased a ticket to Boston, departing at 8:15 a.m., and waited on the platform with a single suitcase containing his cash, clothes, and the .38 revolver. At 8:03 a.m., two transit police officers approached with polite but firm instructions. A bomb threat had been called in specifically for his train. All passengers were being rerouted. The next available departure would be delayed indefinitely pending investigation. Torino looked at their faces and saw no deception, only bureaucratic inconvenience orchestrated with surgical precision. 9:41 a.m. LaGuardia Airport became the next option. At the ticket counter, he requested the next available flight to anywhere outside New York. The agent typed efficiently, then frowned at her screen. She made a phone call, spoke quietly, then returned with apologetic professionalism. His name had been flagged in the system. There was an outstanding warrant, possibly a clerical error, but until resolved he could not board any aircraft. She suggested he contact the authorities to clear the matter. Torino left the airport walking quickly, sweat soaking through his shirt despite the cool temperature. 11:15 a.m. The George Washington Bridge offered his final escape route. Torino drove his Cadillac up the approach, only to encounter orange construction signs channeling vehicles into a single lane. Workers in hard hats and reflective vests directed cars away from the main span. Bridge maintenance, unscheduled but urgent. One worker, a massive man holding a sledgehammer, looked directly at Torino and checked his watch. The message was unmistakable. This escape route was observed, controlled, and closed by order of Bumpy Johnson. 2:47 p.m. Back in his apartment, Torino made the decision that would seal his fate. He called his last two loyal associates, Carlo and Dino, both desperate for money and stupid enough to believe Torino still had power worth following. If he couldn't run, he would fight. If Bumpy Johnson wanted a confrontation, he would get one. They would drive to 409 Edgecombe Avenue and settle this dispute the way men settled disputes before lawyers and bureaucracy complicated violence. 10:15 p.m. The three men arrived at Bumpy's building in Torino's Cadillac, each carrying concealed firearms and the false confidence of armed stupidity. The lobby was strangely quiet, empty except for an elderly elevator operator in a burgundy uniform who sat reading a newspaper. The operator looked up without surprise, as though he had been expecting them. When Torino demanded to see Bumpy Johnson, the operator folded his newspaper with careful precision and gestured toward the elevator. He explained that Mr. Johnson was waiting in the basement beneath the building where private business was conducted away from residential disturbance. The elevator descended with brutal finality. The basement corridor led to a single heavy door. When Torino pushed it open, the trap revealed itself. The room was soundproof to theater-grade specifications, furnished simply with a table and chairs. Carlo and Dino were already inside, slumped unconscious in chairs against the wall, their guns removed, their arms tied securely behind them. Whatever had happened to them had occurred silently, efficiently, with no visible struggle. From a second door, Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson entered. Impeccably dressed in a charcoal gray suit, he carried a leather briefcase and moved with the unhurried precision of a surgeon. He sat across from Torino, placed the briefcase between them, and opened it with deliberate slowness. Inside were fountain pens, bottles of ink, sheets of writing paper, and a small medical kit containing scalpels and antiseptic. Bumpy looked at Vincent Torino with absolute composure. "You're going to write that apology now, Vincent. The question is whether you write it on paper first or directly on your skin." Bumpy Johnson did not raise his voice. He did not need to. The soundproofed basement absorbed everything except the methodical precision of his words as he began to recite, verbatim, every insult Vincent Torino had spoken about Mame Johnson at Minton's Playhouse. Each racial slur was delivered back with clinical detachment, like evidence being read in a courtroom where the verdict had already been decided. Each fabricated story about hotel encounters and infidelity was laid out systematically, stripped of its crude bravado and exposed as the desperate lies of a small man trying to appear important. Bumpy explained the fundamental law that Torino had violated. In Harlem's Underworld, a man could challenge another man's business, his territory, even his life. But a man's wife was civilian territory, protected by codes older than any written law. The psychological assault lasted exactly 11 minutes. Torino sat frozen as his own poison was delivered back to him with surgical accuracy, each word landing like a physical blow. His earlier confidence evaporated as he realized that 18 witnesses had been interviewed, that 12 had given detailed statements, that his own associates had confirmed every syllable. This was not a negotiation. This was a sentencing hearing. Bumpy opened the leather briefcase and arranged its contents on the table with the precision of a surgeon preparing instruments. A sheet of cream-colored stationery, a fountain pen with black ink, a sterile lancet from the medical kit. He explained the choice with business-like clarity. Torino could write a detailed apology acknowledging each specific lie he had told about Mame Johnson, each racial slur he had used, each fabricated encounter he had described. He would sign it with a single drop of blood drawn from the lancet, a symbolic gesture requiring only the surrender of pride. The apology would be delivered privately. Torino would leave New York within 24 hours and never return. His life would continue elsewhere, diminished but intact. Or Torino could refuse, in which case the apology would still be written, but carved directly into his chest with a scalpel, each word forming permanent scar tissue that would serve as a living testament to the cost of disrespect. Bumpy checked his watch and waited for the answer that would determine whether Vincent Torino walked out of this room intact or became a permanent advertisement for the consequences of crossing Ellsworth Johnson. Vincent Torino's response revealed the disease that had brought him to this basement. Even facing surgical mutilation, even with his unconscious associates tied to chairs as evidence of Bumpy's reach, even knowing every escape route had been systematically closed, Torino could not bring himself to apologize to a black woman. His racism ran deeper than his survival instinct. He spat on the cream-colored paper, called Bumpy a name that combined racial hatred with obscenity, and declared he would die before he bowed to any woman of her kind. The words hung in the air like a death sentence he had pronounced on himself. Bumpy sighed, a sound of genuine disappointment, as if Torino had failed a simple intelligence test. He nodded once to two men who emerged from the shadows, professionals who moved with mechanical efficiency. They stripped Torino's shirt, forced him onto the table, and secured his arms and legs with leather straps designed specifically for this purpose. Torino screamed threats and slurs, his voice hoarse with terror and defiance, but the soundproofing absorbed every syllable like a hungry grave. What followed was not frenzied violence, but calculated surgery. Bumpy removed his suit jacket, rolled up his sleeves, and selected a scalpel from the medical kit. Each letter was carved with deliberate precision, shallow enough to avoid major blood vessels but deep enough to ensure permanent scarring. The pain was extraordinary, designed to be felt, but not to kill. Torino's screams eventually dissolved into sobbing, then into silence broken only by ragged breathing and the methodical scrape of blade against skin. The message carved into his chest read, "Mrs. Johnson, I lied about you with racist lies. I called you names no decent man would use. I invented stories about hotel meetings that never happened. I am a racist and a coward. I apologize for my disrespect." Vincent Torino. Each word was spaced perfectly, centered on the canvas of Torino's chest, written in a script that would heal into permanent scar tissue. The entire procedure took 43 minutes. When it was complete, Bumpy cleaned the wounds with antiseptic and applied temporary bandaging. A doctor entered immediately, a legitimate physician who asked no questions and provided professional medical care. He administered antibiotics, applied proper dressings, and ensured the wounds would heal without life-threatening infection. Bumpy Johnson was not interested in murder. Murder was silence. He needed Vincent Torino alive, functional, and permanently marked. As the doctor finished securing the final bandage, Bumpy put his suit jacket back on, adjusted his tie, and leaned close to Torino's face. His voice remained calm, almost conversational, carrying the weight of mathematical certainty. "Tomorrow morning you're going to walk through Harlem. Every person who heard your lies about my wife is going to see what happens to men who disrespect her. You're going to be a living apology letter. And when people ask you what happened, you're going to tell them the truth. Because if I hear you've changed the story, if I hear you've tried to make yourself the victim, I'll bring you back here and we'll start carving on your face." September 21st, 1966, 9 a.m., Vincent Torino stepped onto 125th Street with his shirt hanging open, bandages removed per explicit instructions. The carved apology on his chest was visible to anyone who looked, letters still red and weeping fluid that stained his torn white dress shirt. Two of Bumpy's men flanked him at 10 feet, not as guards but as shepherds ensuring the prescribed route was completed exactly as ordered. The morning air was 48 degrees, and every degree felt like needles against the raw nerve endings of his exposed chest. 9:15 a.m., the route had been planned with surgical precision. 10 blocks north to 135th Street, past every location where Torino had spread his fabricated poison about Mame Johnson. Word had traveled through Harlem's communication network with military efficiency. By 8:30 a.m., phone calls had been made, conversations whispered in beauty salons and corner stores. The message was clear: Vincent Torino would walk through Harlem wearing his punishment like a sandwich board advertisement. 9:32 a.m. People lined the sidewalks 3 and 4 deep, not in celebration but in silent witness to a lesson being administered in real time. No one shouted. No one threw objects. They simply watched, their faces registering emotions from grim satisfaction to uncomfortable pity. Mothers held children's hands, turning them away, but not before the children saw enough to understand that actions carried consequences. The silence was more brutal than any jeering, transforming Torino's walk into a funeral procession for his own reputation. 10:02 a.m. At each symbolic stop, Torino was forced to pause. The barber shop where he had bragged to customers. The corner store where he had told lies while buying cigarettes. The social club where he had performed for small-time operators. At each location, Bumpy's men pulled his shirt wider, exposing more of the carved text, turning him slowly so every face in the crowd could absorb the sight. The psychological destruction was systematic and irreversible. 10:47 a.m. Minton's Playhouse represented the epicenter of the original crime. Inside, 14 of the 18 original witnesses sat in chairs arranged in a semicircle, summoned by personal visits. They had been given a choice: attend voluntarily or explain to Bumpy Johnson why they chose not to witness the conclusion of the story they had witnessed the beginning of. All 14 had chosen to attend. Torino was directed to the center of the semicircle and handed a small mirror. He was instructed to read aloud what had been carved into his chest. His voice cracked on the first word, barely audible. He was told to speak louder. He repeated the carved message, each word an act of self-destruction more complete than any physical beating. Mrs. Johnson, I lied about you with racist lies. I called you names no decent man would use. I invented stories about hotel meetings that never happened. I am a racist and a coward. I apologize for my disrespect. Vincent Torino. 11:15 a.m. Two patrol officers from the 28th Precinct observed the procession from their vehicle on 132nd Street. One reached for the radio to call for backup. The other placed a hand on his partner's arm and shook his head. The radio crackled with a message from their sergeant, "Let Harlem handle its own business." The patrol car drove away slowly. 11:34 a.m. At 135th Street and 7th Avenue, a black Chrysler Imperial sat idling. The rear door opened. Inside, on the leather seat, lay a manila envelope containing a one-way Greyhound bus ticket to Philadelphia, departing at 1 p.m., and a single typed message on familiar stationery. The message carried the weight of absolute finality. If you ever speak my wife's name again, next time I'll use a knife instead of a scalpel. You have 90 minutes to collect your belongings and board that bus. If you're still in New York at 1:01 p.m., the scars on your chest will be the least of your problems. September 21st, 1966. 12:12 p.m. Vincent Torino boarded the Greyhound bus to Philadelphia, carrying 2 suitcases containing $6,200, 3 changes of clothes, and a .38 revolver he would never fire again. He moved stiffly through the terminal, each step a negotiation between pain and urgency, his shirt buttoned as high as it would go to conceal bandages that would need changing in 6 hours. He sat in the back row, watching New York disappear through tinted windows, understanding with absolute clarity that he was witnessing the last moments of his former life. He would never return. By 4 p.m. That same afternoon, Vincent Torino's numbers operation had ceased to exist as an independent entity. The absorption was administrative, seamless, and surgical in its precision. His runners were visited by polite men in well-tailored suits who offered continued employment under new management, with slightly better percentages and significantly clearer rules about acceptable behavior. His collection points became Bumpy's collection points. His $38,000 monthly operation became a footnote in a larger empire. Not a single bullet was fired. Not a single negotiation was required. The transition occurred with the efficiency of a corporate merger executed by professionals who understood that violence, while sometimes necessary, was often the least elegant solution to territorial disputes. The story spread through Harlem's underworld with viral efficiency, mutating slightly with each retelling, but maintaining its essential genetic code. The graphic details were whispered in back rooms and pool halls, often exaggerated beyond recognition. But the core principle was understood with mathematical precision. Mame Johnson was nuclear territory, and disrespecting her carried consequences that made death look merciful. Men who had never met Bumpy Johnson learned his wife's name and committed it to memory alongside fundamental lessons about survival and self-preservation. The incident became folklore, a cautionary tale that would be told to young operators for decades. Mame Johnson never acknowledged the incident publicly. On September 22nd, she attended her regular Thursday morning charity meeting at Abyssinian Baptist Church, wearing a burgundy dress and pearl earrings, discussing fundraising strategies for the community food program with the same grace and dignity she had maintained throughout her marriage to Harlem's most powerful man. If she understood the systematic destruction that had been executed in her name, her face revealed nothing. She continued her work with the local knock-up chapter, organized charity dinners, and walked through Harlem with regal composure. Her silence on the matter was more powerful than any speech, reinforcing the understanding that she existed in a stratosphere where the violence committed in her defense could not touch her dignity. The strategic impact on Harlem's criminal landscape was immediate and measurable. For the next 2 years, until Bumpy's death in 1968, rival factions operated under a revised set of unwritten bylaws. Business competition remained fierce, territorial disputes continued with their usual brutality, and violence remained the primary language of conflict resolution. However, personal attacks on families vanished almost entirely from the strategic playbook. Rivals who despised each other would nod politely when encountering each other's wives in grocery stores or church services. The line between combatants and civilians, which Torino had attempted to erase, was redrawn in indelible ink and enforced with the threat of consequences worse than death. This incident represented the essence of Ellsworth Johnson's operational philosophy, refined over 4 decades of survival in an environment where mistakes were typically fatal, where lesser men would have simply killed Vincent Torino and created a potential martyr. Bumpy transformed him into a living advertisement for the cost of disrespect. Historical records show that Vincent Torino resurfaced in Philadelphia 6 months later, working as a low-level bookkeeper for a small time loan operation. He lived in a basement apartment, avoided Italian social clubs where his past might be recognized, and never rose above clerical work. The scars on his chest never fully healed, forming raised keloid tissue that remained visible until his death from a heart attack in 1979. Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson died of heart failure at Wells Restaurant in July 1968, but the lesson carved into Vincent Torino's chest lived on in Harlem's Underworld for decades. In a world where the legal system refused to protect black dignity, where institutional racism was woven into every courthouse and precinct, men like Bumpy Johnson created alternative systems of justice that operated in basements and back rooms. And sometimes, when the offense was grave enough and society's laws proved inadequate, those alternative laws were written in blood.